Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute promoting a free and virtuous society. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/podcasts. If you have a comment or an idea for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@acton.org. Acton Line is available to stream on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and acton.org. Want to watch more from Acton? Visit ondemand.acton.org. There you will find hundreds of lectures, conferences, and Acton events through the years. They're categorized, free, and more content is regularly added.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, Librarian and Research Associate at the Acton Institute. Today I'm joined by Josh Herring, Professor of Humanities and Classical Education at Thales College. Today we'll be talking about Josh's new book, Sons of Adam, Daughters of Eve, C.S. Lewis's Image of Gender, published by the Davenant Institute. Josh, welcome to Acton Line, and thank you for being with us.
Well, thanks, Dan. It's great to be here.
So about a month before I learned about this book, I started rereading Chronicles of Narnia, which I had only read. I'd only actually half read. I got through Dawn Treader at some point in sort of early adulthood in my 20s, and I liked it, but I just, other things came up, never finished it. So I was rereading it, and I noticed, I was struck in the very first book of that series, the actual first book, not the weird HarperCollins, in-universe order that they tried to come up with. But the actual first book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The denizens of Narnia refer to the child protagonists who are transported from England to the land of Narnia as the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve. Now, this is both a biblical reference, but it's also a gendered reference. And it's very important in the narrative of that book and as the series unfolds. Is it fair to describe Lewis as sort of a gender thinker or a gender theorist? You have this book which takes this evocative title from this. This is a thread in his main series. It is a theme he returns to again and again as you pull out in your book. When did you first notice this, that C.S. Lewis seems to be sort of preoccupied by gender and returns to it again and again?
Great question. I first spotted this when I was in a tutorial with Dr. Ben Lockard. We were reading a bunch of Lewis together, and I got stuck in Paralandra.
Mm-hmm.
There's part of the Ransom trilogy, book 2, and there's this scene at the end of the book where there's sort of a mystical, poetic encounter that the protagonist Ransom has with these two spirits. They're called Eldilla in the language of the series. Malacandra and Paralandra. And in describing the scene, Lewis narrates that in that moment, Ransom saw the true meaning of gender. And there's another line in that same section where he says that gender is more real than sex. And this kind of threw me aback because this book was published in 1943.
Mm-hmm.
It was not published in 2023, where I was like, wait a minute, we cannot shake a stick without running into a gender theorist in 2023. But there weren't that many people thinking about that, I thought, in the 1940s. And I started trying to unravel that thread. And as you mentioned throughout the book, I show that it really is everywhere in Lewis. He's doing this in a lot of his essays. He's doing a lot of his nonfiction, kind of literary criticism, monograph level works. But then once you're looking for it in his fiction, he is very attuned simultaneously to traditional, what we might call gender stereotypes, but also rooting those in a deeper reality that is not less than biological, but it is more than biological.
Mm-hmm.
Lewis, I think, would suggest that we do need to, in fact, fight for the word gender. I know plenty of folks on the right would just love to get rid of the word gender and say it's all about biological sex. Why can't we just go with biological sex? Lewis suggests that, in fact, there are certain cultural realities that arise and that those cultural realities are coded masculine or feminine in different cultures. And it's not that they are necessarily always done only by men, but they are typically done by men because that is the kind of thing that those who are male do. Mm-hmm. And that those stereotypes in our culture tend to have some grounding in actual reality. And so gender does suggest some higher reality that it points back to. And it's that higher reality that Lewis is trying to map and describe and define in sort of a poetic Neoplatonic way. So once I spotted this, it just sort of seemed to show up everywhere.
Yeah, and this is a good way that you frame it because I think, there is the sort of, we'll call it the kindergarten cop mentality. And I won't give it the whole spiel because this is a family program, but it's basically
Right.
boys have certain parts, girls have certain parts is the answer that this kindergarten child gives. And in very awkward times in the film's narrative arc. But there's this richer understanding of gender, of sort of these sorts of differences that, are biologically informed, but not wholly referent to. Why should we turn, and this actually makes Lewis in a way sort of ideally suited for this moment. Like when as a society we're facing, some gender trouble, we'll say, or some confusion about gender. Lewis is somebody that speaks to this in those terms in a way that like actually addresses the sort of distinctions that modern gender theorists try to make, but he takes it in a very different direction, and it's a very sophisticated analysis. How do you think he measures up as an interlocutor to those sort of major sort of gender theorists today?
Well, I think Lewis measures up quite well. I suspect that answer shouldn't surprise you or our listeners. I mean,
Yeah.
I really think Lewis does a phenomenal job in communication. And the
Mhm.
clarity of his vision and the way that Lewis operates is one primary distinction I would draw from most gender theorists.
Mhm.
Most gender theorists, I'll just reference the two I spent some time with in the book, Simone de Beauvoir and then Judith Butler, are kind of famously obscure and obfuscatory in their writing, particularly Judith Butler.
Mhm.
Simone de Beauvoir writes in sort of mythical images that ought to be footnoted and sourced but are not.
Mhm.
Butler just writes in ridiculously confusing prose. Lewis sets forth his ideas in a way that is very clear. And he
Mhm.
does it in these two different registers that I think appeal to both different types of people, but also different types of thought.
Mhm.
He's got sections of his writing that are thoroughly propositional, philosophical,
Mhm.
where he's laying out a case, contention by contention, almost as a chain of syllogisms, where
Mhm.
you find yourself nodding along. Well, I accept proposition A and proposition G, and suddenly I'm in agreement with conclusion X.
Mhm.
Um, and he does, in terms of gender, the place for that is his essay Priestesses in the Church,
Mhm.
where he's asking the question really, and this was a live question in Anglican theology on Lewis's day. Can women serve as priestesses? Is that even a theological possibility?
Mhm.
And he goes through to construct a nuanced argument to say, linguistically, theologically, the answer is no. And
Mhm.
he philosophically and argumentatively, he takes it out of the personal realm. He openly admits that there probably are women who are more pastoral than a lot of priests. But he goes and says, actually, but that's not the question. The question is, can a woman represent God to the congregation? No, because God is ultimately the masculine, and we all, male and female, receive God in a feminine manner. And in that sense, a woman who cannot participate in the masculine because she is feminine cannot represent the ultimate masculine to the congregation. Now, that kind of argument may or may not be persuasive, but it's only going to be persuasive to a certain kind of person who wants to follow the intellectual route and is willing to go this philosophic evidence and proof route. The other way Lewis tends to argue, I think, is far more persuasive is through poetic image. And
Mhm.
it's through showing you these images and it's showing you the goodness and the evil with by these images that Lewis engages the imagination. And so what I think he's always trying to do is help us see what is good and see what ought to provoke our loves, but also to see what is wrong and what ought to provoke our hatred. He talks about this in The Abolition of Man. He borrows from Aristotle to say this is what education is always doing. It's teaching the young human animal to love what he ought to love, to hate what he ought to hate. Lewis is doing the same thing. And so I think where modern gender theorists have, they've really, and again, I'm just going to stick with Judith Butler as the archetype or archetypal example.
Mm-hmm.
Butler argues by just asking a string of questions. She will, and each of her questions seems to imply a certain answer. And you finish a paragraph of Butlerian questions, and you're left thinking, I think I somehow doubt everything that I've always believed about what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman. And yet she hasn't actually proven anything.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, she's just erected doubt where previously there was certainty. I think Lewis is operating just in a totally different register, and he does so wanting to help the reader see what is true. And
Mm-hmm.
in doing so, he reaches in these both philosophical and poetic modes. So I think he's far better in raising the real questions of gender. What does it mean to be made male and female?
Mm-hmm.
Why are both of those things we ought to celebrate? How do we see them as gifts, and how do we love being made who we are? He raises the questions and he gives us answers through the images that he writes.
This is a great way to lay it out, and particularly that article about sort of the nature of the ministry in the church. In the Catholic Church, we often talk about the priest acting in persona Christi, and of course, Christians the world over, the church is predominantly considered as a feminine. The church itself is feminine. God the Father is masculine, but also, interestingly, in a gendered way, but not in a sexed way. To say that the church is feminine does not imply that the church is made up only of female congregants. It's made up of male and female congregants. But there's a richer way in which all of the congregation participates in that gendered female role as the church. So one of the ways that this is, and I wonder about, Lewis is famously not Catholic and frustratingly not Catholic to many Catholics who love Lewis.
Dan, you have to leave us one.
No,
I mean,
and
you guys have so many of the greats.
No,
I mean, you got to leave us one.
I think the Catholics sort of overstep. I once saw a lecture where Joseph Pierce was sort of asked this question after he gave a lecture on C.S. Lewis, in which he painted C.S. Lewis as being very Catholic. And the natural question from the audience was, so why didn't C.S. Lewis become Catholic? Like, he knew the Catholic Church existed. And Pierce gave this very roundabout, shaggy-baggy answer that sort of obfuscated the question. I love Joseph Pierce, but this is it's a tricky thing for Catholics who love Lewis and want to canonize Lewis, that Lewis was not, in fact, a Roman Catholic. And I think there are theological reasons for that. But what this gets to sort of the question is there's also a role in sort of Christian mystical theology, in sort of certain sort of high forms of Mariology, role for the divine feminine. There are Catholic theologians today that some of them, argue for a role of sort of Mary as mediatrix or co-redemptress, this sort of thing. And you actually see this also in other world religions. You have, pairings of Radha and Krishna, Lakshmi and Vishnu, Shiva and Kali. This seems to be something that there's like a through line through sort of world religions, where again they're thinking about this in a gendered, not sexed way, as sort of like Lewis is a Protestant, thinker, theologian. How does he see that role? We talked about that in the limited sense of this question of the question of female priests, but in this broader question of sort of like what is the role of the divine feminine in sort of like Lewis's thinking? Because I think that shows up in some interesting places, and certainly in the poetical works. But you're more well versed in Lewis than I am. Maybe even in these non-poetical prose works.
Well, I think I want to start by not completely, but somewhat rejecting your question, because
Yep.
I don't think Lewis would accept the premise of the divine feminine based on the way he defines the masculine and the feminine.
Yep.
Because this is Lewis in his most Platonic, and there's really three places where this shows up. This is back to that mystical, weird section of Paralandra, back to priestesses in the church. It also shows up to some extent in the Four Loves,
Yeah.
where Lewis sees he sees the masculine as an outward orientation and as a sort of a projection of being, and it's in an almost Thomistic sense that being is proceeding from the nature of God,
Mhm.
and then all other the rest of creation, humanity included, is feminine in relation to that ultimate masculine,
Mhm.
and and as much as all that exists receives its being from God.
Mhm.
So Lewis, at the highest level, sees the masculine and the feminine in terms of directionality, and
Mhm.
it's a question of projection of being and then of receiving being. So I don't see an equivalency between the divine masculine and divine feminine that Lewis would then be able to square logically. And I
Mhm.
don't think he would even try, because he valued logical precision to a great deal. And that's not to say he's not deeply, deeply interested in the question of like what exactly is the feminine and how does it relate. Two places come to mind. He talks about in the Four Loves. He talks pretty specifically, and if you're reading it looking for Lewis being a little explicit, this is, I think, one of the closest places he gets to being pretty explicit about what he's talking about.
Mhm.
But he talks about the marital act as being the union of the sky father and the earth mother,
Mhm.
and that in coming together, husband and wife are in fact enacting these roles. And he then goes on to quickly say, but the most important part of enacting these roles is to keep in mind this is a sense of play,
Mhm.
because no woman would rightly receive this obeisance that is only due to the holy God on high of the Bible. If
Mhm.
she actually took that seriously, she would be causing her husband to commit idolatry and so on. And no husband would rightly demand that his wife treat him as the sky father, and so he's accepting a tyrannical role. This is a sense of play that Lewis sees. The place that I think comes closest to answering your question as originally asked is probably Till We Have Faces.
Mhm.
And it's the one that I just honestly, Dan, I ran out of room and time in this book to work Till We Have Faces into the overall thesis.
Yeah.
If there's a place left for further research on like Lewis and gender, at least in the mode that I've been operating in, I think it's definitely Until We Have Faces. Because there you get the character Orwell,
Mhm.
who is, of course, a woman. She is interacting with her sister Psyche. Psyche marries the god of the mountain. And then Orwell causes, in a direct material sense, causes the breakup of her sister's marriage. Orwell then moves in this very masculine mode. My friend Michael Opisi has done a lot of scholarship on Till We Have Faces, and particularly that relationship. And he argues that, in fact, Orwell is becoming less herself as she is becoming this hardened masculine woman. So there's something in there about like to what extent do her circumstances require her to become other than who she really is.
Mhm.
But then the second half of the book, this monarchical hardened Orwell is in direct confrontation with the gods.
Mhm.
And she's in a trial scene with the gods. And part of her trial scene includes her having this mystical encounter with a story wall that shows all of these moments where she and Psyche have borne each other's burdens.
Mhm.
And I still maintain I don't truly understand what Lewis is doing in that scene. Like, it just seems to me like there's something very powerful, very profound in that part of Till We Have Faces, that each time I come to it, I'm sort of knocked on my back, but I don't really know what he's doing. But I think it comes closest I can think of to answering your question about the divine feminine. Like, there's something there about how Psyche and Orwell relate and how they are shaped and how they relate to the world and yet remain themselves and grow. Lewis is saying something profound there. I just haven't quite figured out what it is.
Yeah. And there's this, I mean, there's this, when you go back to the Four Loves and that idea of the divine Leela explaining some of this imposition, I mean, this is something that other religious traditions do as well, and might be a way that Lewis can sort of synthesize some of the pagan sort of Western heritage with the Christian tradition. This is something, again, Until We Have Faces, we have a lot of these pagan motifs that, are consistent in Lewis, but are particularly striking there, and sort of working around different ways to accommodate that. So we've talked a little bit about how Lewis is formed and his writing is informed by the Christian tradition. We've talked a little bit about that pagan tradition and how that sort of complements it, deepens it, but also complicates it in some interesting ways. But you pointed out in your book, and I found this really interesting, is Lewis also has these other folks, these other sources that you see, like a lot of this Lewis drawing from. Milton is one, but you look at these earlier figures in literature that share some real common ground with Lewis and that he might be drawing from. Could you unpack that a little bit for our audience? Because there's some other threads that you've identified that are in the background of a lot of Lewis's work.
Sure. I think it's one of the places that we don't always think about Lewis in this vein, but it's a huge part of his life and certainly the majority of his scholarship. We tend to, I suspect, think of Lewis as the Christian apologist of mere Christianity and the problem of pain and on miracles and so on, and maybe letters to Malcolm in that same genre. Or Lewis, the fiction author, maybe from the Ransom trilogy and and Narnia. But there's this whole other realm of Lewis's writings that, unless you are yourself a literature teacher or professor, you may not have reason to go digging into these. But they are some of his richest writings, and it's Lewis the literary scholar, and it's he authored the Oxford Handbook of the, or he called it the Oh Hell volumes, the Oxford History of the English Language,
Yep.
Particularly for the 16th century, 17th century excluding drama, 16th century excluding drama, and he, to write that book, the man read every book in the Bodleian Library published in that century. Just astonishing. His first book of scholarship was called The Allegory of Love, and it is a deep dive into the medieval tradition and trying to conceptualize for a modern academic audience how exactly the medieval imagination perceived the allegorical mode and how they found that to be a very rich method of expressing truth. But then you get into his later writings, and at the same time as he's writing Perelandra, he writes that in 1943. In 1942, he published a preface to Paradise Lost. He collected his lectures when he taught Paradise Lost. I believe he was still at Oxford at that point. And then he published those. Later in life, just before he died, he collected his lectures from a Cambridge course on Renaissance literature and published that as The Discarded Image.
Yeah.
Then he had a student of his took Lewis's class on Spenser's Faerie Queen and published his lecture notes. It's a little bit like Aristotle. I mean, most of Aristotle's texts that we have are cobbled together from student notes. Spenser's Images of Life is a book that is sort of written by Lewis, but is primarily shaped by his students' notes and then cobbled that together. So there's a huge amount of material to work through when you're looking at Lewis on a literary level. I went and looked at, I had the same professor I was reading Lewis with when I kind of spotted this. Dr. Ben Lockard is a Spenserian, and I read the Faerie Queen with Dr. Lockard. And then when I came back to Lewis, I was like, man, there's a lot of parallel stuff here. And that really that was an area that was far less explored. Not very many people today read Spenser's Faerie Queen, which means that there are not very many folks who are ready to see the connections between Lewis and Spenser. So I went back and kind of looked. There have been some people who have tried to do a one-to-one correspondence between characters. Jadis is this character in the Faerie Queen, that sort of thing. I don't think it's that simple. I think Lewis actually, instead, he read the Faerie Queen so often and loved it so much that he absorbed a few key ideas from Spenser. He learned from Spenser how to set up a tableau, a pageant that's rich with symbolic meaning. He learned how to create atmosphere and the feeling of being in a world. This is part of why Narnia has all the emphasis on the air. In several of the later volumes, the kids always, the Narnian air had begun to affect him. He had recovered his strength because of the Narnian air. But then you also get this really complex view of allegory that Spenser is a master of. When I think of allegory, I think first of John Bunyan and a very simple, Mr. Worldly Wise is a bad guy because he wants to get Pilgrim off the path sort of analysis. That's not what Spenser's doing. Spenser is creating, he might have a 50-page poem in Spenserian rhyme that is all illustrating temperance.
Mhm.
And every character in book 2 of the Fairy Queen has some connection to temperance, but is also an actual character.
Yeah.
They're not flat in that way. And so what happens when you read the Fairy Queen is that this image of temperance builds and in multiple layers and its complexity. And so by the time you finish it, you actually have a far deeper category in your mind of what temperance is. And you have all these different shades and applications of temperance shown through the characters. And yet there is an actual story that is happening, that is a kind of a thick story. So I like to think of that as a thick sense of allegory. Lewis does the same thing. He doesn't do something nearly as simplistic as say, gee whiz, cowardice is bad, courage is good. Instead, he's going to show us Caspian at the beginning of Prince Caspian, and he's going to show us Caspian as sort of a soft city boy, and who maybe is excited about the idea of going to battle, but has never gone to battle. And then he's going to show us Caspian sleeping in the woods, camping with the dwarves and the satyrs and the centaurs. And then he's going to show us Caspian as this like more hardened battle warrior prince who is under Aslan's howl, trying to figure out how to feed his soldiers. And suddenly we realize here is we've seen this image of courage developing. And it's never as simple as cowardice is bad, courage is good. It's actually this growing picture of courage. I think Lewis gets that straight from Spencer.
Okay.
From Milton, now let me pause there.
Yeah.
Dan, do you want me to follow up there? And I'll hit Milton in a second.
No. I think the allegory is great. The allegory is great. And the Spencerian sort of technique is definitely there. I think you're absolutely right about that. And that's one of those great observations. With Milton, so Milton is also theological in a very sort of explicit way, like Lewis is. And maybe that could be the jumping out, because there's a literary technique, but there's also a sort of like, okay, how does that become theologically infused is also like an interesting question.
No, that's a great
the way
question.
That Lewis utilizes that Miltonian legacy.
Yeah, I think the Milton connection, I at least don't see that as being as pervasive as I see the Spencer connection. I think Milton, I draw this a little bit from the preface in Paradise Lost. Lewis talks about, he writes in glowing terms about Milton throughout all of Preface to Paradise Lost. And then at the very end, he critiques Milton for two things. The first critique is that God is kind of boring. And so is Adam. They're boring. Milton has made goodness boring. And so that the second critique has to do with depicting sexuality. Lewis critiques Milton for two scenes. Milton does a pre-fall and a post-fall sex scene with Adam and Eve. And they're really interesting to kind of see the difference in those two. Lewis critiques Milton because he says you can't actually do that scene and describe that without stoking lust. So you've tried to do your best to be poetic, but still you kind of got a little porny in your poetry. And Lewis then, the following year, the preface comes out in 42. 43, he's published Perelandra. Perelandra is Lewis's attempt to do his version of Paradise Lost. It is deeply theological. It is all about the scene it's all about the question of like what would happen in a perfect world. And yet Lewis, I think, has he's trying to make sure he doesn't fall prey to those same flaws. And so he's specifically attempting to do something I think is really difficult as an author. He wants to make goodness interesting and exciting and attractive. And so that's part of why he spends so much time on the theme of pleasure in Perelandra. And he's in the novel, this is, I think I didn't realize this until I was thinking about the difference between a fallen world and a perfect world. In a perfect world, which Perelandra is in the story, pleasure is actually a signpost to the good. Pleasure is not something that needs to be like monitored and checked, and that you have to rigidly control how much pleasure you indulge in. Those are all the habits that we develop as restraining adults who know, either experientially or through principle, we know that pleasure can often derail us in all kinds of intemperate ways. Well, so Lewis puts this world where what you actually want to do and what you desire is actually an indication that the thing that you long for is correct.
Mm-hmm.
And he does that in an absolutely beautiful way. He also changes the story by removing the Adam figure.
Yes.
The Adam figure is off scene for 98% of Paralandra. He shows up at the very end. And that gives Lewis the ability to still have some mystery and suspense and not have Adam giving exposition every 50 lines, kind of like Milton does in Paradise Lost.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, but you also see, I mean, the way Lewis constructs the Adam and Eve figure, Tor and Tenedril, is very similar to the way Milton writes Adam and Eve. Like they've got some similarities. I think Lewis does make his Eve figure probably more obviously intelligent.
Yeah.
We miss some of the. I don't think the Eve figure strikes modern readers as being particularly intelligent. But that's not a problem that hits you when you read Tenedril in Paralandra.
Absolutely.
Lewis, I think, he's not inventing any of this. He's not making it up wholesale. Instead, he's illustrating the truth that when you stand on the shoulders of giants, you can see pretty far. And when you write inside the tradition, you can write in some really incredible ways.
It is amazing. And Lewis, I mean, I think this standing on the shoulder of giants is a great theme and a great segue into what I want to talk about next, because there's Lewis's influences, which we've talked about. But then there are those influenced by Lewis, which is basically everybody who's written science fiction and fantasy since Lewis, and then theologians and all sorts of things. But particularly his reception among sort of science fiction and fantasy authors has been decidedly mixed. Some people look at him as a master of the genre. Some, major figures in contemporary fantasy are very critical of Lewis, particularly for his depictions of women. And particularly they're critical of Lewis because of his treatment of female characters or gender. What do you make? You write a little bit about that in your book. What do you make of that? I mean, let's start with the positive, because there are people who treasure Lewis, who have built on his legacy in very constructive ways. So let's give those folks their due, but then let's also hear out a little bit from the critics, and then hear your judgment on what you make of those criticisms.
Sure. Okay. So starting with, particularly in the realm of science fiction, I think I think folks who critique Lewis for science fiction are probably correct to think that. Well, no, you wanted to start with the positive. Let's back up. I'll start with the positive. That's where my brain goes. I mean, I think I honestly, well, this is an area I'll just admit I've not read a ton of people looking at Lewis to critique it or praise it as science fiction.
Yeah.
I have read, Brad Berzer writes a little bit about this. He did an essay for Modern Age not long ago. He kind of puts Lewis in there with Ray Bradbury as one of the positive enchanters of science fiction in the mid 20th century. I think in terms of sci-fi, I am not in any way any kind of authority on the interpretation of science fiction. So I'm a lifelong reader of science fiction, but I don't know that qualifies me to have any kind of justified opinion. But my sense is that the genre of science fiction is predominantly interested in material change based on a technology. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, Lewis is writing something that is almost uncategorizable as science fiction. Mm-hmm. And even Out of the Silent Planet, he's clearly riffing on H.G. Wells. Yep. He sort of nods to that in the introduction, but he departs from that very quickly. Mm-hmm. Paralandra, we've even moved beyond some sort of it's not really a piece of technology. It's a box that is moved by an angel that gets ransom from Earth to Venus.
It's very much a fantasy book.
We're no longer in the realm of we need a technique. And by the time you get to that hideous strength, Lewis is so much more interested in it's the hideous strength I find very difficult to categorize, because on the one hand, you can look at the whole novel as a massive critique of modern science. Mm-hmm. And Lewis says that pretty bluntly in the intro or in the introduction. He talks about this as being the fairy tale version of the abolition of man. Mm-hmm. But the more interesting section is where Lewis is very, very medieval. And he's having the medieval planets descend and inhabit Merlin to bring about the judgment of Babel upon
Mm-hmm.
these mad scientists. And Lewis is just it's really hard to categorize. So in terms of reading it as science fiction, I don't know that it's had nearly the impact I would like it to have had, because the majority of science fiction has moved away from any sense of enchantment, any sense of we need to ask these big metaphysical questions in science fiction. The genre tends to operate inside of a evolutionary epistemological framing that Lewis just isn't really interested in.
So I think that breakdown was just absolutely brilliant about sort of so science. C.S. Lewis is kind of I think wrote one sort of by the book science fiction novel, which is Out of the Silent Planet. Paralandra, I think you're right. It's a retelling of Paradise Lost with some unique sort of alterations in a science fiction sort of frame. And That Hideous Strength is like half dystopian science fiction novel, half like whimsical fantasy ending to a dystopian science fiction. So I think you're right there. And I think, there are moments, I could see there are certain science fiction authors that do come back to sort of these metaphysical themes, usually not in an orthodox way. So like Philip K. Dick is somebody who like does some amazing things that I think are very, very similarly imaginative to Lewis, but his Christianity is pretty straightforwardly Gnostic. And there are novels in which that is in fact like dramatized and laid out, and in some cases explicitly explained. As a fantasy author, though, I think Lewis has like bigger legs and a bigger legacy. And I think both his greatest admirers and his greatest critics are to be found among sort of contemporary fantasy authors. We could talk about some of those admirers, but the critics are very pointed and very prominent. And I think of like three people in particular. Philip Pullman talks about how he was inspired to write the His Dark Materials trilogy as sort of a response to Narnia and to give children something that they don't have to read Narnia because they have this alternative. J.K. Rowling has been critical of Lewis's depiction of women in some of his fiction, and so has Neil Gaiman, lately discredited due to sort of horrific allegations of the way that he himself treated women, but was someone who was very pointed in his criticism of Lewis's treatment of the women in his novels, if not in his life. What do you make of those sort of critics of Lewis, those fantasy critics?
Well, I'll answer your question. I just want to shed a tear for the fall of Neil Gaiman. If I read the article, I listened to part of the podcast. If it's true, he's been off the reservation for a long, long time. But I have loved his stories for many, many years, and I was just that one.
Genuine talent, genuine, amazing talent.
I was like
deeply troubled, but amazing talent.
I've wanted for years. I've never actually done this, but I've wanted for years to have some reason to justify an academic project exploring Gaiman's use of Greek mythology in The Sandman.
Mm-hmm.
And so if any listeners out there are looking for a noble cause to give like, I don't know, a couple $100,000 to like stake me a few years to write that book, like email me. But nobody's ever gonna do that. But I just love that story. I was just very sad to see that. But to your question, Dan, the flashpoint there is the problem of Susan in the last battle, which I think is really interesting. That the prior novels don't tend to bring people out in droves. There are some obscure academics who will. I mean, there are essays I footnote in the book that look at The Horse and His Boy as sort of an attack on the Arabic South and the Middle East. There are folks who will kind of they'll read some racial tension stuff into Lewis. But the popular criticisms are all related to Susan. Of course, that's the scene where Susan does not she's not with her siblings in the last battle. And the line that triggered the others is that lipsticks and nylons and too much focus on being grown up.
Mhm.
There's been a really interesting dialogue that I'll attempt to summarize briefly. That's in chapter 5 of the book. I go into a lot of detail on this, but it's been a really interesting dialogue that's surrounding what did Lewis actually mean there.
Mhm.
Pullman and Hickman and Rowling all assert, I think without any kind of adequate proof, that this is Lewis rejecting a young woman who is exploring her sexuality and is becoming licentious in her dealings with young men, and Lewis therefore cast her into hell. That's their collective judgment of this. That's not at all what Lewis says about this passage. When he had a habit I just find absolutely astounding. He answered every letter that a fan wrote him about the Chronicles of Narnia,
Mhm.
and he has one of those letters. He does. A child wrote in very concerned about Susan, and Lewis explains that the once a king or queen in Narnia, always a king or queen in Narnia means that there is certainly still hope for Susan, and
Mhm.
that he did not write this as like Susan is forever condemned and an eternal separation from Aslan and Aslan's country. There's a Susanna Black Roberts wrote, I think, the best explanation of this passage that I didn't work into the book. So if anybody reads
Oh
the
yeah.
book, you won't find this one in there. This essay is in the Davenant Institute's previous work on Lewis, Life on the Silent Planet, Essays in Christian Living in the Ransom Trilogy. Susanna does a phenomenal job, I think, in analyzing that passage and suggesting that actually Susan's persistent problem is a lack of contentment. And
Mhm.
it's a lack of receiving the gift that Aslan is giving her. And so, what her sin there is the sin of rejecting Aslan and rejecting, and she is pretending that all their experiences in Narnia were a childish game they made up.
Mhm.
Well, in all strands of Orthodox theology, if you pretend that Jesus is something that has just been made up, you are out of fellowship with Jesus.
Mhm.
And so your hope of salvation is directly related to your right connection of being in right fellowship with Christ. And so that's what Lewis is showing there. He's showing of these four children who had remarkable experiences with Aslan. And at one point, Aslan tells Lucy and Edmund, "You're getting too old. You must come to know me by another name. You've had all these adventures in Narnia so that you may come to know me by another name in your own world." They need to move from childish adventures with Aslan to adult faith in Jesus Christ. Well, Susan is here representing, I think, a very real image of what's incredibly common of children who grow up in the church. They may have a childish faith that falls away in adulthood. And the same hope that Lewis says about Susan is the same hope that I think every parent of a prodigal has for prodigal children. It's like, well, my child has wandered away from saving faith. Well, it's not like, oh, well, this evil God has therefore condemned my child to hell. It's like, no, I need to pray for my child to return to faith in later adulthood. That's what Lewis is doing. But I don't actually think that any of those authors, and I'm just going to particularly focus on Pullman because he's the most vicious of those
Yeah.
three. Rowling, in particular, I hope that she has repaired this failing in her character since then. But she said at the time that she had not actually read the Chronicles of Narnia.
Mhm.
But she was very certain that Philip Pullman was correct.
Yeah.
So hopefully she's read these books since then. But I think they're actually responding to is the fact that Lewis is very conscientiously presenting a world where the truths of Scripture are presented very clearly as a gift to be experienced, not a set of doctrines to be taught, but rather poetic images to be experienced imaginatively from the reader and in real life from the character's perspective. And so they're interacting with that. So Pullman, in particular, is writing an atheistic fantasy.
Mhm.
He's in the same camp as George R. R. Martin. Martin famously said that he started Game of Thrones trying to imagine an atheistic version of Lord of the Rings,
Yeah.
and there you get Game of Thrones. That's the same. That so what you ultimately have is critics who are not really or fantasy authors who are not really exercising the task of criticism. They're not really weighing whether or not the story is good on its merits. They're responding quite bluntly and quite, I think, wrongly to Lewis's theology. They're not willing to even interrogate it and ask, how well is the story crafted. They're simply saying, I disagree with your theological perspective, therefore your story is bad.
Mm-hmm. I think, yeah, I've found these criticisms to be unfair. That being said, I think, that hideous strength is kind of a mess structurally. Like, there are legitimate criticisms that one can make of Lewis,
Sure.
but I think a lot of these are ideological criticisms. And I think you're absolutely right in pointing that out. One of the things that we haven't talked about, although you kind of brought it in the last segment, which was great, is, he would answer these children's letters, which, is a great treasure trove for scholars such as yourself, sort of digging through these issues. You can get a lot of insight from them. There's also sort of, what did Lewis had a very unconventional sort of personal life. Like, he was sort of a bachelor for very many, many years, married very late in life. First is just sort of a favor to a friend to sort of, make sure she wasn't deported. That later, like, they did have an actual Christian marriage later, and the story of that is well told in the film The Shadowlands with Anthony Hopkins, and he wrote a little bit about that. But what is a Lewis's own life as you're looking at his literature? Was there anything that in Lewis's life that you thought? We've talked about sources in the scriptures, sources in the sort of Christian theological tradition, sources in other aspects of our Western heritage, be they pagan heritage or medieval heritage. Some of these literary antecedents, but then there's the life of the man himself. Do you see that sort of show up in any ways that you thought were interesting as you were exploring this topic in the book?
Yeah, I think it goes to. I want to answer this question and tie back to a part of your question I dropped from the previous segment.
Okay.
So,
Perfect.
I mean, this I think this is another place where Lewis often gets you have to defend Lewis on this point a lot if you're in favor of Lewis's views, because his interactions with women were weird in some ways, and there's, without going into all the Mrs. Moore stuff, like there's I think there's now ample evidence to say that that was not a relationship that was going to fit with Lewis's later in life faith, and like that's a place where Lewis was a very complex individual. But Lewis writes a lot about women. He doesn't have a lot of obvious, objective, apparent relationships with women in the way that you might expect.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's not married, as you mentioned, until the 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't have biological children. He does have relationships with other women, but he's got friendship with Dorothy L. Sayers.
Yep.
He's got a couple of nuns that he wrote a lot of letters to. He's got academic connections. But one of the places where that then comes in is that people critique Lewis's female characters as caricatures of women.
Mm-hmm.
And some of that I think is somewhat an easy attack to make if you're bent that direction. Mm-hmm. It's relatively easy to look in that hideous strength and say Jane is kind of she is a stereotype. She's not a real vivid character. Mm-hmm. But I think that sometimes misunderstands what Lewis is doing. Mm-hmm. But I mean, Lewis, this is part of our failure in reading today. I mean, we are so sensitive in the 2020s to everything must be nuanced and represent everything else, and it all must be representative. Lewis is simply not doing that, and he's also not writing a novel that is trying to do what I'm trying to think of a good example. What say Evelyn Waugh is doing, mm-hmm. where Evelyn Waugh's novels are say Brideshead Revisited. Charles Ryder is a distinct character who is only Charles Ryder. Mm-hmm. Lewis is not doing that. Lewis's characters in that Spencerian way are themselves, but they're also representing these larger types, forms, ideas, images. Mm-hmm. So Jane is a real character in that hideous strength. She's also supposed to represent some of the struggles that an academically inclined, newly married woman might encounter. Mm-hmm. Like Lewis wants you to read Jane and think, Gee whiz, it is really hard to balance the needs of academic study and keeping a house.
Hmm.
And it's perfectly understandable that a woman who is married and pursuing a PhD might want to practice contraception.
Hmm.
Lewis wants to, he's putting all that together. And then he wants to say, okay, actually, this could create a toxic marriage. Doesn't have to, but he's going to show you a marriage where Jane's set of issues combine with Mark, the social climber,
Hmm.
Mark, the one who's always gone, Mark, the absentee husband, Mark, the husband with no spiritual vitality or center to his own being, and say, what does this toxic marriage look like? And now, how do we redeem this toxic marriage? And what does this woman who is insufficiently feminine and this man who is insufficiently masculine, how do they both need to change in order to come back together and heal their marriage? That's really the question that those characters are doing. But if all you're looking at is saying Jane and then say, well, Jane must be this woman in Lewis's life, or Jane is just a stereotype of all women, you really misunderstand, I think, what Lewis is doing.
Hmm.
He got enough flack when that Hideous Strength came out that in one of his letters he did write an articulation of what he was trying to do with Jane.
Hmm.
He received a letter where the author of the letter said, "Are you trying to suggest through Jane's dissertation that women can't be academics who write dissertations?"
Yeah.
Because in the first chapter, Jane is writing a dissertation on John Donne. And the sonnet that she is studying is all about the body and the importance of the body. But Jane's internal monologue is all about how she is disassociated from her body.
Hmm.
Well, Lewis responds in that letter say, no, I am not trying to say that at all. What I am trying to say is that Jane's dissertation is derivative and it's basic and it's bad. And anyone who knows John Donne should know that this is an awful dissertation that no one should ever write. The point here is that Jane has no business being in graduate school because she's actually not doing unique work. That's the point that Lewis was trying to make. He wasn't even offering a commentary on a woman in graduate school. He was looking at totally different things. But when folks go to Lewis with sort of this bent to see Lewis as a either for women or against women, they just sort of misread him.
Hmm.
Um, this is symbolized and polarized by two figures that I talk about or two scholars I write about in the book. Mary Stuart Van Leeuwen wrote her book, The Sword Between the Sexes,
Hmm.
where she takes one line, not even a full sentence, but one line from Lewis's book, The Problem of Pain,
Hmm.
and argues that Lewis has reversed everything that he ever said about gender after Joy Davidman died.
Hmm.
You can hopefully hear from my analysis that I strongly disagree with her interpretation of Lewis.
Yeah.
Monica Hilder is a much better, I think, reader of Lewis. She takes Lewis at face value and thinks, okay, Lewis had views on men and women. All of those views very early in his life are articulated as sort of commentary on the universals,
Hmm.
the universal masculine, the universal feminine. His views get more nuanced as he gets older. His views do change and soften to some degree after he gets married, which hopefully is, I think, a good sign of growth, that hopefully
Hmm.
all of us find that after marriage, we understand being male and female a little bit differently than we did before marriage.
Hmm.
So I think Hilder is a better reader of Lewis, but that tension point about Lewis and his relationships with women throughout his life, and then how female characters show up, it is a place that anybody stepping into Lewis scholarship, you got to sort of read around to kind of see how people land on that, because it's definitely a place where everybody has a side or at least a view.
Yeah, there are landmines in the scholarship. Another story that I thought about was the story of him. He actually modified an argument in Miracles, in his book Miracles, after a critique made by Elizabeth Anscombe. So there are women intellectuals that not only did he respect, but like informed his own work through their criticisms. So there's another sort of very obvious example of the
Well, I find it
esteem that
helpful some.
that Lewis did hold women scholars.
I find it helpful sometimes to keep in mind that, like, in his fiction, Lewis is often trying to create an image of the universal in some way. Not
Hmm.
always, but that's a tendency. In actual life, he's always dealing with the particular person in front of him.
Hmm.
So like that's where the letters come back in. I mean, he's writing. He gets some really. I originally wanted to read through all of his letters to see where if they had anything on gender in them, and I had to abandon that section of the project.
Mhm.
But I read through his letters from 1950 to 1953. I mean, he got some kind of bizarre letters from married women all over the United States would ask Lewis all of their theological questions.
Mhm.
And they'll send in these kind of like, my husband said this, my pastor says this, what do you say? And Lewis would return these long explanatory letters, like weighing all these things and having all these suggestions. I mean, he would deal with each of those as a particular case.
Mhm. So this is the exact opposite of how Robert Heinlein used to respond to fans. Is he had actually like a form letter that he would check certain boxes and send it back. He did respond, more kindly to some queries, but the fan mail got to be so much to Heinlein, and Heinlein wanted to respond. And many questions there were sort of very standard answers to, and he just made it readily apparent that these were very standard questions that were asked and very standard answers that were coming back. As we wrap this up, one of the things, and I was thinking about this book, and I was thinking as I was reading it, I was like, people who are interested in Lewis, of course, should be very interested in this book. There's, you go through a ton of material, maybe not all of the letters, but so much of the philosophical, theological, poetic, literary work is sort of combed through on this question, and you really get a fuller perspective. I had these inclinations through reading that, like, Lewis seems to have like something very substantive to say here, and your book validated that suspicion in spades and gives me all sorts of new rabbit trails to go down. But there's also like your average reader isn't a scholar, isn't a literary critic, but your average reader is either a man or a woman, and I think that there are things that you can take away from this that can cause you to reflect and think about your own sort of nature as a man or a woman. And I was just wondering, as you were doing this research, is there anything that you yourself, like in thinking about it, did Lewis help you rethink, or maybe just have a fresh perspective on something that you had always thought but never like had been, explicit, or caused you to reflect more deeply on your own sort of masculinity? And then what are the things that you hope that maybe readers who maybe, there are a lot of people today that are confused about issues of sexuality and gender. And a lot of people who just, they grow up in contexts where, maybe they don't grow up in a two-parent home where they have ready examples of masculinity and femininity in their life. How do you hope that this work could, maybe enrich those people's lives beyond sort of, the scholars and the critics, but the everyday sort of man and woman in the street?
Man, Dan, that was an epic closing question. Like that, I think there were like 6 questions in there.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I'll hit all of them, but I'm gonna try.
So we could start with the personal and then go to the general. Like that.
Yeah,
That's the general. Yeah.
Well, my first recommendation for the general reader, if you are not an academic and this conversation has intrigued you enough that you want to order the book, I think that's great, because my journey career-wise has kind of been mostly in the classical education space and in writing for kind of normal internet consumption. I write a lot for Acton's Religion and Liberty Online, for example. And so there are vast portions of this book that are accessible to the non-academic reader. Just if you are of that sort and want a recommendation, I would just suggest skip chapters 2 and 3 and plan to come back to those if you really want the academic stuff. But the intro, chapter 1, chapter 4, and chapter 5, and the conclusion are all very accessible, I think, 'cause those are the parts that I wrote most with sort of the general argument in mind. Chapters 2 and 3 are particularly where I'm attempting to, like any good dissertating person should do, I've got to prove my academic chops. And when my parents read this, when it was in dissertation stage, I lost them in chapters 2 and 3, but I got them back in the last 2 chapters. So I do think Okay, so let's go then next to the what I kind of figured out about masculinity and femininity. And I want to answer that question without getting too personal, but I think
Yeah.
I really did find it a really helpful way of conceptualizing what exactly masculine bodily strength is for and what exactly the impetus towards male leadership is for. And there's all kinds of studies and stats you can look at to prove this, but I want to just reference one. What I mean by male leadership, there is a very traditional sense of the man as the head of the home, and that modern society really pushes back against. But I read a fascinating essay in the Free Press that was published by a an author who had lived through the California fires that burned a big section of Los Angeles last year. And this author was talking about the fact, just this weird thing that had happened. This had been a West Coast, super egalitarian, upper class, very wealthy neighborhood that suddenly a vast portion of these houses are burned out and they have to fix their own problems for a few weeks because the state of California is just unable to solve their problems. Well, suddenly this author was writing about there is a mass reversion. There's no more egalitarianism in crisis mode. In crisis mode, the women are cooking the food and making sure that the kids are fed. The husbands are out like planning safety and making sure that everyone is staying alive and then somehow getting food to bring it back to the house. And suddenly you have, of all places, an upscale neighborhood in California is going back to these very traditional gender roles. I was like, it struck me as fascinating because Walter, what Lewis is getting at is that the masculine is all about leadership and protection for the flourishing of others. The feminine is all about creating the conditions that are conducive to life. And Lewis is writing about those, and he shows those united in marriage, and he shows that they each reach their fullness in complementing the other. And then it's one thing to see that in literature; it's another thing to see that worked out in kind of the one of the most left-wing states in the United States. To be like, this area, like here they are, like no, this is what all the men are doing. Their strength is not for like gaming on Xbox or doing keg stands. Their strength is actually for protecting the home and providing for their families. And these women are actually they have something that is very fundamental within them that crisis has brought out. That if you ask any of them, and they're gonna sound off the standard left wing talking points about egalitarianism and women can be CEOs and lawyers and all that. But when push comes to shove, they're the ones making sure that there is food for their children. And I think there's something very real about that Lewis is trying to articulate in a positive way. And I think that's the piece that I took away most from this whole project is thinking our need is not actually for someone else to write some graphic description of transsexual surgery and so on. Like people have done that now to the point that if you're interested in that, you can find those descriptions on the internet. It's graphic, it's gross. That's not actually our need. Our need is for we need to be ready to celebrate the goodness that it means to be made male and the goodness that it means to be made female. And I think that's really what Lewis helps us do. So I've been more attuned to that since this project.
My colleague Dylan Palman was teaching a catechism course at his church with the young kids, and there was a section of it on sort of sexuality and gender. And he talked about it the way he thought through it was, it's not so much that people need instruction in anatomy as it is they need instruction in reality and reminders of reality. And that is also a way in which this deeper sort of gendered conception of masculinity and femininity that is beyond, biological reality, which is important, but there's so much more to being a man and a woman in the world than just that. And Lewis reveals that in a very profound way, and you reveal it in Lewis in a really great way for this book. So thank you so much for sort of starting this conversation on sort of C.S. Lewis and gender. There have been people who have criticized Lewis, but you take that into account in your book and you present sort of like a very broad overview of the way he thinks through these issues in various forms, in literary criticism, in literature, in theological essays and philosophical essays. And it's really great and a really great service to folks that are interested in Lewis and interested in these questions of gender in the modern world. So.
Well, I'm really excited that this book has come out, and that I hope it will be a help to people. I hope it's a help to remind people that these things are universally true, and that we have been culturally and certainly academically out of the habit of proclaiming things that we do know to be true. And I think you mentioned earlier, what about folks who kind of grow up either missing mom or missing dad in the home? I think those folks, I think the same thing is true and there's a sense in which the church is a great community, that I think the church as the family of God often compensates for some of the weaknesses in our actual earthly families. But it's also very helpful to have people like Lewis remind us that these things are universally true. I may have seen a bad instantiation of that. I may not have enough images to look at, but Lewis is kind of drawing from the tradition to give us those types to look at, and I think that too can be a help.
Well, Josh, thank you so much for being a help to us in understanding it and appreciating it in Lewis, and thank you so much for being on Acton Line.
Oh, it's been great to be here, Dan. Thanks for the conversation.
We will have a link to the book in the show notes and all of those great articles. I have a note with all of this scrawled out. We will have a bibliography for you if you want to dig deeper into Lewis. Thank you again, Josh.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Acton or hear more of this podcast, please visit acton.org/podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.